This video will talk about which characters you can potentially skip points in the ultimate on, but you don't have to. If you're interested in characters where you should skip the ultimate on in most situations or skip multiple points on in it, then I would recommend checking out the video that's linked right here. This is the second part of a 3-part series, and the third part will be about gods where you should not skip points in the ultimate. To clarify this once again, it's not intended for you to skip the first point in the ultimate. The first point is pretty much always crucial. We're talking about skipping second, third, and so on, as those often don't give you more additional high benefits above the first point. Also, if your god is not mentioned here, he will probably be either in the first video or in the video that's coming after this, where I will talk about gods which should not be skipped, where the ultimate should not be skipped. So please have patience if your god hasn't been mentioned yet. I will make sure to mention your god because I will go through all gods. Again, these are the gods where skipping points in the ultimate can be done but doesn't have to be done, and often depends on the matchup, the situation, your experience on the character, and so on. I will call these the debatable ones. AMC, Amusen Cup, has 80 damage on his ultimate versus 55 damage and CDR on his 2. It's a trade that you can take, especially as you have that ability damage that you need more early on, so leveling the ult is better in that regard. But at the same time, getting a decent amount of damage on the 2 is kind of nice for clear and presence overall, but then again, AMC doesn't really need too much help clearing. I would say this depends on if you think you can bully your lane opponent better with the 2, then I would max the 2. If you are able to 100 to 0 your opponent, if you max out the ultimate, then I would max out the ultimate. Really a matter of choice. Amaterasu. Amaterasu gets a lot of damage from leveling the ultimate. If you confirm all 3 hits, it is 180 extra damage per point. However, when are you actually going to confirm all 3 hits? So I would say it's dependent on what your role is at that point and how well you are able to land the ult. So it depends on the enemy comp as well. If the enemies don't have many escapes and you're reliably able to get off the damage from the ultimate, it's definitely great. If you think that you're only going to use the ultimate in teamfights as a setup tool and try to just CC people, but get your damage in other ways, or get your utility other ways, or you need more lane clear, more sustain in lane, then you can skip points and level the ultimate later. Anhur. Anhur is one of those where it's really dependent on skill level, I would say. In total, if you were to hit all the hits of the ultimate, then it would be 200 extra damage. And if you do that, I would not skip points there. On the other hand, Impale gives you a safe 65 damage. Early on, you're gonna have a lot of poke battles with Impale, and sometimes you may not want to go all in with the ultimate, but just, keep poking. But then again, Anhur is pretty much a 100 to 0 character, so it's a choice where I'd lean more towards putting points in the ultimate, but it's possible to skip them. Aphrodite. Aphrodite gets 0.3 seconds duration on the ultimate, and she also gets 5 seconds cooldown reduction by maxing it. So this is kind of a decision that depends more on how you're going to use the ultimate. If you think you're going to use it for extended immunity frames because the enemies have abilities that last for a while and or are able to deal damage after a moment, then I would put the points in. If you're primarily using the ultimate as a cleanse for teammates, then it's not that logical to put points in, and other abilities are more helpful. Especially in lane early on when you're on your own, I don't think the ultimate is worth all that much because the heal from the 3 especially should be better at first. Then we have Athena. Athena gets 100 extra damage from the ultimate, 5 seconds cooldown reduction, and the ability costs an extra 10 mana. It's good and it's bad. The damage is not that relevant. You're hardly ever gonna try and kill someone with the ultimate. That's more of a lucky thing. The cooldown reduction can, though. It can, but it doesn't have to be. It also depends a lot on where you're playing her. If you're playing Athena in solo, for example, or in jungle, I would probably just skip the points and use them for the taunt or the 3, as that helps you more. But as a support, being able to rotate as much as possible is great. So if you think that you're gonna use that ultimate on cooldown pretty much and just use it to move everywhere you can, then I would just do it for the cooldown reduction. It's really a matter of how fast the pace of the game is, how much you will have to lurk around in one lane, or how fast you think you can set the game pace by using the ultimate more as well. Awilish. Awilish is one of those characters where I personally hardly ever skip points on, but it very much depends on the situation. It gives you 50 extra damage, 10% attack speed, and 10 power, so those stats are decent but not crazy. The point here is that often a target is dead as soon as you use the ultimate anyways, or that the enemy will use beads or anything to get out as soon as you use the ultimate. If that's the case, then you're better off putting points into something else. For me, the main issue here is that nothing else is really worth leveling all that much. The only thing that is the 2, so I would rather point skip on the 3 to get a point in the 2 and the ultimate as soon as you can, and then keep leveling the ultimate. But this is a matter of taste. Some people think that the poke from the 3 is sufficient to justify leveling it over the ultimate, and I can see the point there. Bellona actually gets a crazy amount of things out of her ultimate. She gets 100 extra damage, 10 power, 5 protections, and a 1-second duration, and most of this applies to her teammates as well. So as a teamfight ultimate, I think this ability is amazing. Question is, if you are leveling it, are you already in a teamfight phase, and are you going to use it that way? I think that often other abilities can help you more in lane, especially. And if you're using the ultimate primarily as an escape tool, as you get ganked a lot, then you're not going to get all that much out of all these extra stats in the radius of the flag. I would generally recommend leveling the ultimate on Bellona, but there are situations where it can not be all that helpful. Chang'e. Chang'e gets 75 damage and plus 10 mana cost by leveling the ultimate. That is an okay amount of damage. She has other abilities that also help her a lot, especially the heal is something great to max out just to sustain lane better. At the same time, the ultimate is such a huge game changer in team fights. So once again, this depends on how deep in the laning phase you are. If you think that you're gonna have a lot of team fights, then I would max the ult. If not, then you might as well skip it. We also got Cupid here. Cupid gets 80 extra damage out of his ultimate. However, if you were to level his heart bomb instead, both detonations together, the hit and the detonation, would give you 60 extra damage on a much lower cooldown. What you have to keep in mind is that the AoE damage from the ultimate is much larger, so if you hit multiple targets, it becomes worth it more. So once again, it's more a decision of, are you in a team fight phase or are you still in a boxing phase? As Cupid, as an ADC, you will often stay in a boxing phase longer, so you can consider leveling the heart bomb first. Erlang Shen gets some rather crude stats out of his ultimate. He gets 75 extra heal, 1.25% damage mitigation, and an 0.1 second taunt. These are mostly defensive stats, so if you're playing the offensive game, then I think you can allow to skip points here. If the enemy team has a lot of anti-heal, I would also skip points here. Or if you're considering to not go deep into defense so that that damage mitigation doesn't really do much, then you could also skip points. If you're more of a team fight oriented player, you have a decent amount of defense, and the team fight's already starting, then I would level the ult just for that extra healing because it's really nice. But I think it really depends on the situation, and often the damage will do more for you. Fafnir. Fafnir is one of those characters where I would strongly lean towards not skipping points on the ultimate, but I know there are very niche situations where it can be done, so it is worth pointing out in that regard. What you get out of the ultimate is 60 extra damage on the initial ultimate tick, 5 seconds extra duration for the dragon form, and 20 extra damage per dragon breath tick. The point is that you're playing Fafnir as a support most of the time, and as a support, damage is not all that relevant. However, I think that 20 damage per tick on the breast is still really good, simply because it is a massive amount of damage for a support. Not many supports can even come close to min damage, except for maybe Ares, for example. And that damage can secure kills that CC wouldn't be able to do, even though other abilities might help you more in that regard. Also, the extra duration is really crucial for me, especially since I think that the steroid in the ultimate is so strong. And if you have the chance to get it off more often because your ult lasts longer, in my opinion, that's worth leveling, but I can see why some people would prefer other abilities at certain points of the game. Guan Yu. Guan Yu gets around 75 extra damage out of his ultimate, assuming you hit 3 strikes on a target, and it costs 10 extra mana. However, if you were to level another ability, you would get 100 damage extra, and you get the protection reduction on top if you're level 3. Or you get 30 extra healing for your whole team, which also scales up with the passive. So it's more of a question if you want to trade with the ultimate. If you want to go into a team, dive deep, and deal the damage you can, all the damage you can, and you're playing Guan as solo, I can see the reason to max it first. If you're playing Guan in support, I would rather go for other abilities that help your team more, as they are more prevalent in that regard. You are going to use the ultimate to set up a lot, not so much to deal heavy amounts of damage, and in that regard, it's just better to go for other abilities. So all in all, it's a question of, are you going to be the aggressive damage Guan or more of a support-oriented Guan? Hercules. Hercules gets 125 extra damage on his ultimate, which is quite a lot if you're finishing off a target. However, if you were to level the 1, you get 70 extra damage and an extra 0.1 second stun. That's not bad, so it's more a question of if you want to bully in lane, poke a lot, or if you want to combo someone to death. Both perfectly viable in my opinion, as the 1 has a much longer cooldown. You can just use it more often, and if the damage is higher, if you're getting off 2 of those, the driving strikes in one fight, then the damage is already higher than the ultimate. But if you're able to hit multiple targets with the ultimate, then the ultimate is better once again. So really a matter of preference. I would probably stick to the ult most of the time, but if you're using the ult more of a CC immune tool and do the damage with a 1, or tanky anyways, I would probably go for the 1. Also a question of if you're playing Herc in solo or support. If you're playing in support, then obviously the stun helps a lot more. Hou Yi. Hou Yi gets up to 90 extra damage on his ultimate versus 45 or 40 instant damage if you will to level one of his other damaging abilities. This is quite dependent on how easily an enemy can get out of your ultimate. If they have an escape to roll out, then you're never going to get even close to those 90 damage. And it also depends on your general playstyle. If you think you can reliably hit your 1 and double bounce it, then I think it's going to deal more damage overall. But if that's not the case and you're using the ultimate to actually fight an enemy and try to keep him in there, then the ultimate is going to deal more damage in comparison. Capri. Capri is an interesting one. The ultimate actually doesn't give all that much. It gives the target that you're ulting 5% extra health and 5% movement speed, and it costs 10 more mana. So what you have to keep in mind here is that 5% health is usually not that much, and more often than not, the target that you ulted will just try to get out afterwards anyways. So at the same time, 5% movement speed is really something that can be completely ignored. And the 10 extra mana can actually be a downside if you can't ult the target because you don't have enough mana. At the same time, the question with Capri is, what would you want to level instead? And that's why I would just put this as questionable, because all of his abilities kind of benefit from being leveled with a slightly longer CC and stuff like that, but nothing is really that impactful that I would value it over the extra health on the ultimate. So it's once again up to you if you personally prefer it or not. Loki. Loki is one of those where some people are really convinced that you should skip the ultimate, and some people are really convinced that you should not skip the ultimate. It is 75 extra damage on the ultimate versus 40 extra damage on the 3 and an extra second of cooldown reduction on the 3. If you're able to apply the 3 once more because of that extra cooldown reduction, then I feel like it can definitely be worth skipping the point. Question is, are you going to blow up a target immediately with the ultimate? And are you not going to blow it up if you don't put the point in it? If you use the ultimate primarily as an escape and you engage without it, then it makes more sense to not put any points into it. If you primarily use the ultimate to engage, which some people tend to do, then it makes more sense to put the point into it. So it's mostly a matter of playstyle here. Mercury. Mercury actually gets the same damage as Loki. He gets 75 extra damage. The ability costs 10 more mana versus, for example, 30 extra damage on the 1, which can crit though, and a radius increase on the 1 on top of that. I do think it's possible to skip the ultimate on Mercury if you feel like you're going to get more damage of the 1, more poke out of the 1, more clear out of the 1 and all stuff like that. At the same time, a well-placed Mercury ultimate is such an impactful, not only disruption, but also initiate damage into a team fight, that if you are able to reliably hit multiple targets with it, then I would not skip the points. So it's more a matter of how good are you on Mercury, if you should skip the points or not. Osiris. Osiris gets 100 extra damage on his ultimate, and that's all. versus, for example, 50 extra damage on the 2. Now keep in mind that Osiris is no one that would 100 to 0 targets most of the time. So the extra damage on the 2 will probably mean that he is able to apply it both, ending up being 100 extra damage as well. Because in an extended trading match with an Osiris, you're going to use the 2 quite often. And even in a single engage with Osiris, in a single boxing engage, you are very likely to hit the 2 more than once if it's against another warrior, for example. So I would generally say skip the ultimate, but then there are also situations where you need that little bit of extra burst because his burst is relatively weak overall, and in that regard the ultimate really helps. So matter of choice, but I would tend towards skipping points here. Red-Tusker. Red-Tusker is once again one of those where it's a question of playstyle, I think. He's theoretically in the same segment as Thor, only that in his case, the ultimate gives you 60 extra damage versus 45 extra damage on the 3 or 60 extra damage on the 2 and 0.5 extra protection reduction. You can skip it and you can also not skip it. If you're more chasing single targets down still, if you're in that phase of the game where you are focused on single targets and you lock them down, or you primarily use the ultimate as an escape, then I would not level it. If you use the ultimate as an engage into team fights and you're a secondary frontliner, so to speak, and you want to have those heavy hitting, knock up, high damage engages at the start of a fight, then I would level the ultimate. Once again, mostly a matter of choice here. Skadi. Skadi's interesting. Skadi gets up to 80 extra damage on the ultimate and an 0.25 second root, while the ability costs 10 extra mana, whereas putting a point into the 1 instead will give you 50 extra damage and 5% slow on the 1. It's kind of debatable what's better. The root can be really good, but it can also be not that good depending on who you are up against, and if burst damage is what you are after, or if you think that you can reliably apply the sustained extra damage. Most targets are not going to stay in the ultimate for the whole period of it lasting, so it's unlikely to actually get those extra 80 damage off. And if you're not that reliant on the root, I would recommend skipping points. If you think the root's important, if you're more of a teamfight focused hunter in that regard, then I would use those points for the extra root. Sol. Sol gets 50 extra damage and up to 70 extra damage if you hit all the points of the ultimate versus 60 extra damage right off the bat and a 5% slow on the 2. This is just purely a matter of preference. I think that the extra 50 damage is nice, and if you can reliably hit multiple shots of the ultimate, then the damage should usually outburst most other things. But if you feel like you just want that extra damage immediately, and you confirm both hits of the 2, then that's better. It's really... Sol is one of those characters where it's really a matter of taste and play style, and there's definitely no set rule for it. Sun Wukong. Sun Wukong gets 50 extra damage and 5 seconds cooldown reduction on his ultimate versus 70 extra damage and 1 second cooldown reduction on the 3 in Tiger form, comparing this to the highest extra damage you can get. So if you have the damage, then the Tiger form is definitely much better, and if you want the extra utility of having a lower cooldown on the 3 as well. At the same time, 5 seconds cooldown reduction shouldn't be undervalued on such a potent ultimate as Sun Wukong's is, not only for team fights, but also for sustaining in a boxing match, for even split pushing and stuff like that. All of that kind of factors in there. So I would generally probably skip the points, because you're not going to make too much use of the extra damage, and other abilities have more extra damage. But as an escape tool and stuff like that, the extra CDR can be very nice, so the points can be well invested too. Sylvanas. Sylvanas gets 50 extra damage on his ultimate, which is a decent number, and that's per target and it has a huge radius, versus 25 extra damage and 25 heal on allies and 5 protections for allies on the 2. Now, the point for me is that on one hand, Sylvanas has that AoE huge damage potential, can knock up 3 to 4 targets with it. At the same time, if the 2 can get you to decent damage numbers as well, and heal your team in the same ability and give you protections, is also very nice. So, as Sylvanas is not a damage-focused character, I would maybe make this a little bit dependent on how much magical defense the enemy has, and also how dependent your team is on the heal at that point. It's definitely not something that should be held up until last. There are other abilities on Sylvanas that I would max after the ultimate in any circumstance, but it can sometimes be worth to delay the points at least a little bit. Tyr gets 75 damage and 5 seconds cooldown reduction on his ultimate. The ability also costs 10 more mana versus a raw 100 extra damage on the 1. So if you're going for damage, then you're not going for the ultimate. However, the ultimate can be used as an escape tool too, and as such, those 5 seconds cooldown reduction can be valuable. I would tend to skip it most of the time, but there are some niche scenarios when you feel like you get ganked a lot of stuff like that, where the ultimate can be worth it. Also, if you are able to level it and dunk the enemies reliably and get that off in a team fight, it can be a surprising spike of damage from a tanky character. Vamana gets extra protections, 5 extra protections, and 15 extra power out of the ultimate. However, due to his passive, the extra power he gets is actually slightly higher than that, but it's not crazy in terms of the extra value that he gets. I would say it's generally not worth it because you have those abilities that allow you to trade a lot better, that have a lot better scaling in terms of power. But if you're more looking towards the defensive side, if you're more looking towards being a frontliner as early as possible, then I think those points can be well invested. Most of the time I would skip it, but there are niche scenarios where I would not. Vulcan gets up to 120 damage out of his ultimate. The up to is important here because it depends on the range. It costs 10 extra mana versus 40 extra damage and 0.5 seconds cooldown reduction on the 1, for example. This is something that in earlier times a lot of people used to skip. The ultimate was generally not considered worth it, but with the ultimate scaling better at close ranges, I would probably not skip it anymore. Even if you're just dropping the ultimate right in front of you, it can deal decent amounts of damage now, and those 0.5 seconds I feel are often not worth it. It can be done, it's nothing that I would rule out, and especially in duel, where you're not dependent on the AoE damage and the ultimate is often just used for clearing minions, I would say you can definitely skip it, but it's not as efficient as it used to be in earlier times. Xingtian gets up to 100 extra damage out of his ultimate if a target gets picked up and hit by all swings, versus 35 extra damage and 5 extra damage reduction, plus an extra 1 second duration, so even more extra damage on the 1. So this is a bit of a crude one. I think it depends on how well you're able to actually pull off Xingtian's ult. If you are against a comp where it's mostly an ultimate / beats forcer, and you're not actually going to get the damage off, then I would say it's not worth leveling, especially with that long wind up now. You just get more out of leveling other abilities instead. If you feel like you can reliably hit the ultimate and the enemy is not prepared for it, doesn't have the corresponding actives and so on, then I would say go for leveling the ultimate. Generally, I would skip it a fair few times, but not always. Ymir. With Ymir, it depends on where you're playing. The ultimate gives you up to 150 damage, which is nice, but it's up to, and it's 3-second wind up, so you're hardly ever gonna get the actual 150 extra damage. You also get 5 seconds cooldown reduction on the ultimate, versus 40 extra damage and an 0.25 second stun on the 3. I feel like even though the 3 is not the highest damaging ability here, that CC is often more valuable, especially when playing with support. Even the wall duration, stuff like that, can be very, very strong. And you're not going to use the ultimate all that often to actually deal a lot of damage. If you're playing him in a solo lane role, and you're focusing on the damage, and you have set up in your team maybe that will allow you to get that damage off reliably, then I would say go for the ultimate and try to get the maximum damage out of it. Once again, this mostly is based on the fact that as a support, dealing damage is not all that important, even though Ymir is on the damagey side. Last one in this category is Xiongqi. He has up to 75 damage per target in his ultimate versus 50 damage on his 1, 50 damage and a 45 heal on his 2, and 55 damage and a 0.1 second stun on his 3. So there are a lot of things in other abilities that come close in damage. The point with your ultimate is that hardly anyone is going to stay in the ultimate for the full duration, so you're hardly ever going to get those 75 extra damage. At the same time, the beneficial part of the ultimate is that it hits everyone around you. Zhonghui comes online late anyways, and you want to maybe look for something that allows you to trade a little bit better early on. In that regard, leveling other abilities first is great, especially having the heal on the 2 and stuff like that. So I would say there are definitely scenarios where skipping the ult is worth it. It depends a lot on when the team fight phase really starts, how much setup your team has for you to reliably get off the ultimate damage and stuff like that. So I would say it can be skipped, but you should definitely know why you're skipping it and what you're doing when you're skipping it. But it is a possibility in favor of other abilities that help your team more, especially when you keep in mind that the 3 has a double stun duration with the mark on it, so you actually get 0.2 seconds stun by leveling that first, which can be great. That concludes the second part, and in the third part tomorrow, we'll finally check out the gods where you should probably not skip points in the ult on. If you haven't watched the first part of the series, it's linked again here. Other than that, thank you guys for watching. Hope to see you for the next part tomorrow. Duke Sloth, out.